He was still alive when he wrote that. Alive, but hollow. He buried her, kept her ring, and stopped practicing medicine entirely. He lived another 12 years, never remarried, and his mask, his original bird mask, is still in a Venetian archive. The tag on it reads simply, Dr. Zaguri, widower. Not plague doctor. Not hero. Just widower. A man defined by the loss of the woman who spent her life waiting for him. So maybe that's the real ending here, not the plague, not the mask, but the silence that followed. The wives of plague doctors were history's quietest survivors. They didn't get statues or saints' days. But in every household that survived, in every line of vinegar-scented handwriting, their presence lingers. And now, centuries later, as we scroll through digital archives and dusty letters, their lives feel familiar again, the isolation, the fear, the waiting. Maybe that's why their story still matters. Because it's not about the dead. It's about the ones who kept living. Soft music fades to stillness. If you're still awake. Thank you for floating through this quiet journey. In the final part, we'll settle completely into the afterlife of memory, how the myth of the plague doctor's wife echoes through literature, ghost stories, and modern art. A final lullaby for the forgotten. Painters, poets, and early filmmakers all borrowed his image. The wives were still gone. But every now and then, a historian stumbled across them. One 1880s medical historian, Dr. Paul Ernst, mentioned in a footnote that wives of plague doctors often displayed symptoms of melancholy, though little else is known. That was it. A one-sentence obituary for generations of women. Let's float into that word for a moment, melancholy. In the 17th century, melancholy wasn't just sadness. It was a respectable kind of sorrow, a quiet grief that lingered without making a scene. And that, really, was the wives' emotional signature. They didn't cry in public. They just folded their grief into the daily rhythm of life, washing, praying, surviving. They became, in a way, Europe's first, coping generation. Not heroes, not martyrs. Just people who kept the world turning when everyone else was dying. It's strange to think that we owe much of our understanding of pandemic resilience to these forgotten women. They normalized cleanliness, daily disinfection, herbal fumigation, practices that would later form the basis of modern hygiene. They were the ones boiling linens, burning incense, and refusing to touch without washing first. Their fear built the habits that saved lives centuries later. And yet, when history was written, it credited the doctors, not the ones who actually washed their hands. Let's drift back to Venice one last time. In 1771, when the last major outbreak struck the city, a doctor named Francesco Zaguri recorded the death of his wife, Caterina. He wrote, "She did not fall to the disease but to solitude. For months she waited behind the door that never opened. In a world that had finally stopped counting the dead, she didn't have to fear the knock on the door anymore. But she probably still listened for it out of habit." There's a line from a parish journal written decades later that captures this perfectly. It says, "The pestilence has left, yet the women still whisper when the wind carries a cough." A simple sentence. But that's generational trauma, centuries before the term existed. Let's wander across to Prague, where plague art took on a more theatrical form. There's a 1713 painting in St. Charles Church showing the Virgin Mary driving away the plague. Below her, a crowd of the dying, and among them, a small, kneeling woman clutching a doctor's hat. Historians think she might represent the wives left behind. It's easy to walk past that figure in the painting. She's small, nearly hidden by smoke. But if you stand still and look long enough, you can almost feel her presence. She's not praying for herself. She's praying for someone else, someone already gone. Meanwhile, in England, plague doctors became historical curiosities. People collected their letters, their masks, their journals. Some were even displayed in cabinets of curiosities, early museums filled with oddities and medical relics. Visitors would stare at the bird masks, whispering about the horror of the Black Death, maybe feeling safely superior to the past. But the wives? Their belongings rarely made it to display. At best, a wedding ring. A recipe book filled with stains and herbal notes. In one collection at the Wellcome Museum, there's a small 17th-century recipe notebook that includes vinegar against contagion and to ease the sorrow of the heart. Whoever wrote that second one understood both sides of the job. By the 19th century, the plague doctor had become pure symbol, a Gothic ghost, the embodiment of Europe's old fear. In Venice, during the annual Carnival, people began wearing the bird mask as a costume. The same mask that once symbolized death and fear now meant mischief and disguise. Rich men would dress as plague doctors and flirt with women under the safety of anonymity. It was the original, creepy Halloween costume. But for the descendants of the real doctors, and their families, this transformation was unsettling. There are letters from the 1720s where Venetian citizens complained that the carnival masks were mocking the sacred work of physicians. One woman, signing her letter only as Maria L., wrote, "My grandfather was one of those masked doctors. He tended the sick when all others fled. Now his mask is worn by drunkards." You can almost hear her sigh through the parchment. She's not angry, just tired of history turning into theater. And so, by the 1700s, the plague doctor's wife became invisible. She wasn't heroic enough to be remembered, and not scandalous enough to be written about. She was history's background noise, the quiet hum of ordinary endurance. Yet, if you look carefully, she's still there. In property records, where widows are listed as keepers of the house. In parish books, where a doctor's widow gets a tiny pension. In wills, where her name appears just once, beside the words, "to be remembered kindly." That phrase shows up again and again, "to be remembered kindly." It's the 17th century version of saying, "Please don't forget I existed." Now, if you'd walked into one of those homes, say, a modest doctor's house in Marseille around 1705, it would feel strangely peaceful. The walls would still smell faintly of herbs and smoke. A few medical books stacked beside a half-burnt candle. A mask, perhaps, hanging in the corner, now just a relic. And a widow, sitting by the window, sewing. Not mourning. Not exactly. Just, existing. So, where were we? Right. The plague doctor's wives, the women who endured, who loved men made of wax and worry. By the late 1600s, the great waves of plague were finally fading from Europe. Quarantine laws, sanitation, and luck, mostly luck, began to thin the black fog that had hung over the continent for 300 years. And yet, the image of the plague doctor lingered. The beak, the robes, the stick, it was too strange to forget. People started to paint them, carve them, even mock them. And with that, a quiet historical tragedy began. The wives disappeared completely from the picture. If you walk through a European museum today, Florence, London, Prague, you'll find endless plague art. Piles of bodies. Angels with swords. Grim reapers counting corpses like they're doing taxes. But the women who lived behind closed doors, lighting candles for plague doctors, they're almost never there. One exception sits quietly in Venice's Museo Correre, a faded drawing from around 1700 showing a man in the plague doctor's mask sitting at a table. Next to him, a woman, no face, just a faint outline, pours water into a bowl. No one knows who painted it. But the label reads, "The Doctor and His Wife." That's it. No names, no story. Two shapes in a world of sickness, trying to share a meal. Maybe she's pouring water to wash his hands. Maybe it's just a metaphor for cleansing. Either way, she's there, the ghost of every wife who washed away the plague with vinegar and prayer. Let's float forward now to the 18th century. The plague had mostly vanished, replaced by more modern diseases, cholera, typhus, smallpox. The world moved on. But the memory of the plague doctor became a kind of carnival joke. One widow, listed as Elske van Rijn, continued attending patients for nearly 2 years after her husband's death, despite having no formal training. She died of the plague in 1657. Her final wages, for florins, were paid to her surviving child. A whole life, summarized in a ledger line. It's strange, isn't it? These women were surrounded by death, yet their own deaths barely made a ripple. No portraits, no songs, no grand epitaphs. Just a quiet note in a parish record that someone's wife, name uncertain, passed away of pestilence. But if you piece them all together, the letters, the lists, the scribbles and margins, you start to see their collective shadow. A generation of women who held the line between chaos and what little remained of normal life. Who hugged their husbands knowing it might be the last time, and did it anyway. And maybe that's why, centuries later, the image of the plague doctor still haunts us, not because of the mask or the death, but because of what it meant to love someone who walked into that every single day. Soft music swells and fades. Let's pause here. In the next part, we'll drift through the later centuries, when the plague faded but the legend of the plague doctor grew, and how their wives were slowly erased from the story, one polite revision at a time. We'll look at art, superstition, and the strange afterlife of these marriages in European memory. If you're still awake, you're doing great. If you're not, well, you're exactly where this story wanted you to be. Ghosts, paintings, and the afterlife of a mask. Soft, steady ambient music, something like a heartbeat muffled by fog. Welcome back, wanderer. If you're still with me, congratulations, you've officially survived 2 centuries of hypothetical disease and emotional exhaustion. And if you're half asleep right now, that's fine. This next part will move slower than ever, like dust settling in an abandoned house. Sometimes the doctors themselves wrote about their families in almost detached tones. A physician named Augustin Lariche noted in his journal during the 1631 plague of Marseille. My wife grows pale each morning as I depart. I tell her it is no matter, that fear is but a lesser disease. Yet I am glad when she weeps, for it means I am still worth her tears. That's about as romantic as it got in plague-era France. Emotion expressed with surgical precision. Now, not all wives stayed. Some, especially younger ones, left their plague doctor husbands behind. And honestly, who can blame them? In towns like Hamburg and Prague, where the death tolls were highest, there are multiple notations in church registries of wives being absent during pestilence. A polite way of saying, she ran. A few remarried before the plague even ended, assuming the doctor was dead. And sometimes, they weren't wrong. Other times, awkwardly, they were. There's one story from Vienna, though probably apocryphal, of a doctor who returned home after months in quarantine to find his wife remarried. Instead of confronting her, he supposedly blessed the new couple and left the city quietly. It sounds saintly. Or maybe he was just tired. Let's drift to Amsterdam, where things took a slightly more practical turn. The Dutch, as usual, documented everything. In the records of the city's plague hospital around 1655, you find entries like: Wife of Dr. Jan de Groot, provided clean linens twice weekly. Wife of Dr. Hendrik Loo, prepared tinctures for use. These weren't idle women. They worked alongside their husbands, mixing herbs, cleaning equipment, keeping notes. Essentially unpaid assistants. In some cases, when their husbands died, they kept serving the hospital, quietly taking over parts of their work. Because someone had to. Records from Augsburg and Basel mention wives who sold herbal sachets, healing vinegar, and protective charms. Basically, early Etsy entrepreneurs of despair. One woman, noted only as Frau Brandt, apparently became locally famous for her miracle rosemary wine. It didn't cure anything, but people liked to believe it did. When her husband eventually died of the plague, she simply kept selling it, now calling it the drink that protected him for years. That's marketing. We often picture plague doctors as isolated, but many had families who tried to carry on as normally as possible. Kids still played, sometimes indoors with herbs tied around their necks. Wives still baked bread, often with vinegar in the dough because someone said it helped. And life, weirdly, continued. In a letter from Lyon, a doctor's wife named Marguerite wrote to her sister. The children ask if their father still wears the mask. I say yes. They laugh. They pretend to be crows. It's both adorable and grim. Kids turning horror into play, just like people do today, really. You make jokes because the alternative is screaming. And yet, through all of this, these women were pillars of emotional endurance. They had no guarantee their husbands would return each day, but they still prepared meals, mended clothes, and lit candles at night. They lived with a kind of acceptance that's almost unthinkable now. There's a 17th-century prayer book printed in Antwerp, and in the margin of one copy, a wife wrote in small, shaky script. May God make him a stranger to contagion, or grant me peace to bury him. A real choice there, protection, or strength to endure loss. Either outcome was part of the job description. One doctor there, Giovanni Di Marco, kept a small notebook, not for medicine, but for prayers. At the back of it, someone, presumably his wife, added a short line in different handwriting. It reads: He left the house on Tuesday. I have washed the floor where he last stood. That's it. No grand farewell. No emotion on the surface. Just a quiet note from a woman cleaning the doorway of a man who may never come home. And maybe she believed that if the floor was clean, he might somehow return safely. Let's pause here, because it's easy to forget what quarantine actually meant back then. The word itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days. 40 days of waiting to see if you were sick. 40 days locked away from everything you loved. Plague doctors and their families lived their whole lives in a rolling quarantine. If the husband was assigned to a lazaretto or an infected district, the family stayed behind closed doors. Wives might leave food on a doorstep. Neighbors would whisper prayers and drop bread without knocking. And then there were the boats. If a ship arrived from an infected port, it would anchor offshore, crews trapped for weeks while the city decided if they were allowed to live. Doctors inspected the sailors through ropes, masks, and shouting. Their wives waited on the docks, staring at specks of human movement across the water. Some of those ships never got clearance. They just stayed there until everyone on board was dead. Now, in some parts of Europe, plague doctors' wives tried to turn their circumstances into a business model. Which sounds harsh, but honestly, practical. If your husband was constantly at risk of dying, someone had to keep money coming in. I find myself divided between my duty to the sick and my longing for your company. Each knock upon the door brings fear that it is my turn. Anne's replies didn't survive, but we can imagine her handwriting, maybe uneven from shaking hands, telling him to be careful, to eat something, to sleep. She probably sealed each letter with trembling fingers, then gave it to a messenger who didn't want to touch it. In plague-time London, even love was contagious. But not every doctor's wife was patient or poetic. Some were furious. In Florence, a woman named Lucia Benetti is recorded as publicly shouting at her husband, also a plague physician, for foolish devotion to doomed patients. In the city record, the clerk notes that she spoke against her husband before the neighbors. Which, for 14th century Italy, was practically scandalous performance art. She had reason, though. By that point, she'd already lost 2 sons to the plague. Her husband kept going back to the infected wards. She called him a man in love with death. And honestly, she might have been right. Because many plague doctors were driven by a strange mix of duty, pride, and morbid curiosity. They wrote obsessively, about symptoms, smells, colors, and dreams. Their wives, meanwhile, were left to handle the silence between letters. Cooking for one. Listening for bells. Watching smoke rise from the city. Let's float south for a moment, to Naples, where the plague of 1656 wiped out half the city's population. Half. Imagine looking down your street and realizing every other door had been nailed shut with a cross. In the next part, we'll float through the diaries and letters of plague doctors' families, the few that survived, and see what it was really like to love someone whose daily commute was straight through the valley of death. Soft lute music fades out, letters, quarantines, and quiet goodbyes. Soft lute music returns, something vaguely sad but not tragic. Welcome back. If you've made it past part 1, that means you either really love history, or you've fallen asleep and this is just background noise for your dreams. Either way, we're in good company. Tonight, we're still wandering through the quiet homes of plague doctors, and more specifically, into the hearts of the women who lived there. They didn't wear masks. They didn't carry walking sticks or burn herbs in long snouts. They just waited. And in a world where waiting could mean death, that was a kind of bravery all on its own. Let's start in London, around 1665, during what they called the Great Plague. Roughly 100,000 people died in a single year. That's about 1 in 5 Londoners. The bells rang constantly. Dogs barked endlessly. And every morning, the dead cart made its rounds, collecting the bodies left outside homes. It was a city living its apocalypse, politely, of course, with wigs and waistcoats. One of the few plague doctors we actually have written traces of was George Thompson, a physician who worked in the poorer parishes of the city. He wasn't famous. Not noble. Just a man who decided to stay when others fled. And somewhere in his letters, the ones he sent to his wife, Anne, you can feel the weariness seeping through the ink. He wrote, Ash. Romance was difficult in the 17th century. At home, wives were the unsung survivors. When plague waves came, everyone lived in fear, but plague doctors' families lived with that fear daily. They saw the little signs first. A cough that lingered too long. A headache that didn't fade. Or maybe just the hollow look in their husband's eyes when he came home and realized, he'd been too late again. It's easy to forget that medicine back then wasn't much more than guesswork with a cape. Doctors didn't know about germs. They believed disease came from miasma, bad air, thick with sin and swamp fumes. So, they burned herbs, avoided certain winds, and prayed a lot. Wives had to participate in all this ritualistic prevention, cleaning with vinegar, burning juniper branches, keeping windows shut. Everything smelled like panic and cloves. But here's the strange part, despite the constant risk, some plague doctors did survive. And their wives often outlived them by decades, going on to live surprisingly peaceful lives in quieter years. A few even remarried, sometimes to other doctors, because apparently, some people never learn. There's a quiet beauty in that. These women lived through one of the darkest centuries in human history, and still managed to keep homes, raise children, and hold on to something resembling hope. If you're still awake, congratulations. If you're drifting, that's okay too. We're only beginning this long, gentle descent through history's strangest marriages. Their wives sometimes got part of these deals too. There are scattered records showing payments made to widows after their husbands died on duty. Most were small sums, enough to keep them fed for a few months. And then they disappeared into the fog of history. But let's step back a bit and think about why someone would even marry a plague doctor. In many cases, these men didn't start as plague doctors. They were regular physicians, or students, or even apothecaries. When the Black Death hit, the city councils scrambled to hire anyone with a medical degree, or at least a decent quill. So, one day your husband's treating coughs and headaches, and the next he's walking into a street full of dying people with a stick and a mask that makes children cry. Some wives probably begged them not to take the job. Others saw it as duty, a kind of grim honor. And a few might have been secretly hoping the city would pay off their debts if he didn't make it back. In Venice, the situation was especially grim. The city had what they called lazarettos, island quarantine hospitals where plague victims were sent to die. Doctors assigned there were practically exiled. Wives could only see them from a distance, waving across the water like widows in waiting. Letters between quarantined doctors and their families were often fumigated before delivery, literally smoked in incense to cleanse them. So even love letters smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. There's one recorded story of a Venetian doctor named Matteo, whose wife sent him a package of bread and dried figs during a quarantine. The guards opened it, poked it with iron rods, and burned half of it, just to be safe. He wrote back thanking her for the gesture, but adding, and I quote, "The bread was mostly." Still, those men had wives who believed them, or pretended to. Women who tried to keep the home steady while the world literally rotted outside. They also had to deal with the masks. Those beak masks weren't just weird fashion choices, they were early attempts at biohazard gear. Inside the beak was a mix of herbs and spices, things like myrrh, cloves, mint, and rose petals. It was supposed to purify the air. In reality, it just made the smell of decay slightly more festive. Now imagine being the wife who had to store that thing. It's not like he hung it in a separate closet marked horror. It probably sat on a shelf near the door, like a cursed hat rack. Every time the wind blew, that empty beak turned slightly, just enough to remind you that tomorrow, your husband might not come back. Let's float over to France, where plague doctors sometimes made their own rules. They charged cities outrageous amounts, refused to visit certain neighborhoods, and demanded better living conditions, for good reason, honestly. If you're going to risk dying for your job, you might as well ask for a decent pillow. One contract from 1629 in Paris listed a doctor's hazard pay, food allowance, and free lodging for his family. Yes, even plague doctors had benefits packages. Some cities offered them citizenship, which was a big deal. Others promised burial rights in the local church, which, again, was mostly useful if you were dead, but still nice of them. The plague doctors' wives, living with death every day. Gentle music fades in, something like lutes and slow heartbeat drums. Hey guys, welcome back to another late-night dive into the quiet corners of human history. So, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights. And if you're listening to this while trying to fall asleep, that's completely fine. Tonight's story isn't exciting. It's slow, morbidly calm, and slightly unsettling, in the best, most relaxing way. We're talking about the plague doctors' wives, the women who lived with men who lived with death. Because while the doctors got their creepy bird masks, their leather coats, and their place in pop culture, someone at home had to wash those clothes. Someone had to worry, wonder, and quietly hope their husband didn't bring the Black Death home in his satchel. So tonight, we're going to glide through the candlelit alleys of medieval Europe, through Florence, Venice, London, wherever the air smelled faintly of rosemary and despair. And we'll meet the women who waited at the window while bells tolled for yet another neighbor. Let's start, gently, in the middle of it all. The year is 1348, and Europe smells bad. If there were Yelp reviews for the continent, this would be a solid one-star situation. The streets are packed with carts full of bodies. Cats and dogs are being blamed for spreading the plague. People are wearing herbs in their pockets because, apparently, lavender was the medieval version of wash your hands. And in the middle of it all, there's a man, a plague doctor, walking through the chaos in what might be history's worst outfit. You've seen it, the long waxed coat, the wide-brimmed hat, and that nightmare of a mask with a bird beak. It looked like a cross between a carnival costume and a sleep paralysis demon. And this man was supposed to make people feel better. But behind that eerie mask, behind the layers of waxed linen and anxiety, was usually an ordinary guy. Not a top-tier physicist.